Hello. Good afternoon. It's Sunday, the 18th of September, 2022, the afternoon before the state funeral tomorrow. And with me is Alex Brummer, who is the city editor of the Mail. This is Money. Alex is one of the, if not the foremost financial journalist, most respected financial journalist in the UK, or certainly one of, author of some very excellent books, and a man I've found over the years who doesn't invest a lot of ego in his opinions, even though they are strong ones sometimes. So he's someone to really listen to. So good afternoon, Alex. It's really nice to be with you.
Roger, very nice to meet up again.
Great. And I think the number of subjects, but the key subject, and as you know, I have very strong views on this, and I've been banging on about it in the media for quite some time, but I'm going to stay stum for now, because what we're interested in is your views. The big news is that the Bank of England is yet again going to raise interest rates probably on Thursday, the seventh increase since about 12 months ago when the rate was 0.1%. The rate is now 1.75% and will move to 2.25%. How do you feel about all that?
Well, I think we're not sure actually if it's going to go to 2.25 or maybe even 2.5. So we're not quite sure. There might be a rise of 0.7 of a percentage point, but 0.75 of a percentage point, we're not quite sure. What I feel about it is that the bank got caught, really, to use a very old-fashioned term, it got caught with its pants down because it was way behind the curve in terms of where inflation was and where its interest rates were. So it remained at super low start of COVID interest rates, which were there to help the economy and the financial markets through a trauma of unprecedented trauma almost at the start of in March 2020, and then when inflation started to pick up, and it started to pick up well before the Ukraine war, it started to pick up in the spring of 2021 last year, and it just sat there and said, this is all transitory, it's all going to go away when the supply chain problems correct themselves. But it was wrong, and so it's had to go very strong quite quickly, and I think that's a bit of a shock for people who got used to super low interest rates. The one thing I'd say about all of that is that people with mortgages have been a bit protected over the years in recent times, because I think it's about 65 to 70% of UK consumers are now on fixed rate interest mortgages, so they don't get an immediate hit, but they will have a hit when the 3 to 5 year fixes come off, and that will happen in the next couple of years.
Well, I think that I agree with some of what you say, and let me preface this by saying that in my experience, when people listen to programs like this about finance, the vast majority of people sort of fall asleep. It's like somebody talking to you about pensions. But I really think our listeners need to understand that this is going to hit them where it hurts. I mean, this is really, really, really going to more than annoy, but destroy millions and millions of people's financial, economic, and life equilibriums. And the question is whether the Bank of England was slow coming off the mark, or whether indeed they should not have been raising interest rates at all, because we don't have consumer-driven inflation, Alex. We have, as you know, what's called cost-push inflation, where material prices and factors other than consumer spending, I mean, after all, people are cutting back, and millions of people are trying to decide between eating and heating. So to raise prices at a time like this, to be pouring the kinds of profits that are going into the banks and the energy companies' coffers, to have people with their monthly mortgage payments more than double, and I get reports of this every day, is it really justified? I mean, you have written in the Mail about, in inverted commas, the blundering Andrew Bailey, the governor of the Bank of England. I mean, he, according to you and others, has made a lot of mistakes before. Is this not another big one? In 2009, the Bank of England was in a similar situation, wasn't it? With rising oil gas prices, the interest rates were 0.5%. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that they just left it alone, let inflation run its course rather than pouring oil on the fires. And they didn't do anything until 2012. Economists like Nouriel Roubini, the Nobel Prize winner, have said that central banks like the Bank of England are, quote, setting a trap for themselves. What do you say to all that?
Well, there's a lot of questions tied up in all that, Roger. Let's go to Andrew Bailey first. I don't think that Andrew Bailey has been a great governor of the Bank of England. He wasn't great at his previous job. His previous job was at Financial Conduct Authority, and when he was there were a number of problems blew up, most notably the problem in the Woodford investment empire, which many people will have heard of. And he was very slow to act and very slow to spot it. So he didn't come with a very shining record into the bank, and he's not an economist either. And I think that counts against him too, because I think that he wasn't able to. He didn't have. I don't think he had the intellectual wherewithal to lead on this particular subject. However, I will make some other points relating to what you've said as well. I think, yes, it is going to be an interest rate shock for many people, but I do think they're more protected. And I think I said that in my first answer. I think that the fixed rate does protect them for a time from higher interest rates. And that's something which we didn't have. I remember when I came back to the UK, I've been living in the United States and working there for many years, and came back to the United Kingdom in 1990. And I was paying 14%, 14% on my mortgage. So I think that below 5% for me sounds like a great treat. And I suspect it's not going to be as hurtful as you think it is. Some people will find it shocking if they've overborrowed, and I think but we've been through a situation where there've been much stricter rules about since the financial crisis, about what banks can do in terms of mortgages, in terms of multiples of salary, in terms of looking at people's whole income rather than just their mortgage outflows. And so I do think that the market is in a much better place when we've had higher interest rates than in the past to absorb it. But it will be a shock, and it's going to be hurtful. But if you look at it in macroeconomic terms, that's in terms of the whole economy. What I would say is this, that we're the mistake, if there's been one, was that we were going through a period where both the Bank of England was squeezing interest rates, it was going to raise interest rates, and the government, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Johnson government was also raising taxes at the same time. That's a very bad combination. You've got a squeeze on fiscal policy and a squeeze on monetary policy at one and the same time. That's not good economics. Now, what's happening now is that Liz Truss, the new Prime Minister, Kwasi Kwarteng, who will be introducing a mini budget, a financial event, fiscal event, I think they're calling it, later this week, are going to loosen the fiscal strings a bit. So the rise in national insurance, which has already been ameliorated a bit, will probably be scrapped altogether. And also there will also be some help for corporations as well, on corporation tax, although that's a tax increase which hasn't actually yet taken place. And there may be some local tax breaks and some help for some smaller businesses as well. So I think you have to look at the whole thing in the round. And I think the Bank of England is going to have to take the strain. And if you look at the pound on the foreign exchange markets, we can't afford in the UK to allow our interest rates to fall behind those of other countries, because if that gap becomes too big, people will pull out of sterling. So I do think there's a lot of considerations to go into this, and I think you have to look at it in a much broader context. But I agree with you; it's going to be a very hard time for consumers ahead. They're facing really challenging times, both on energy costs and on interest rates. It looks as if the government will, and we know they're going to do this because they said so just before, unfortunately, the Queen died. They said they were going to cap or limit energy bills to over the next 2 winters. So that's going to be a lot of help. And hopefully, by the time that limit comes off, the strains in the gas market and the oil market, indeed, both of them actually, in recent weeks, the oil market has come down quite a bit. So that should be helpful. And we've seen petrol prices already fall, and that's already fed into consumer prices. And wholesale gas prices have also started to come down a little bit. Of course, if we have a very cold winter, they go shooting up again. So I don't guarantee, there's no guarantee that that's going to last.
I think that, thank you for all that. Yeah, I think that I actually was hoping that Mr. Bailey was going to be a bit of a hero in the last rate rise, because some of his colleagues on the MPC, the Monetary Policy Commission, wanted to go to 1.5%, and he was pushing for 1.25%. So I thought, oh, well, that's good. But now he seems to be quite vigorous in all this. The other thing, look, Alex, the other thing is I agree with everything you said about mortgages, but you know, you talk about in the round, but as a consumer champion, if you will,
Yeah.
My round is a bit bigger than people who can afford to own a home and have a mortgage. More than 50% of the British public are what's called financially challenged, according to all sorts of surveys and authoritative sources. And I think that if you feel that people with mortgages are protected compared to how they were before, and I remember I was here when the interest rates were 14, 15%, it's pretty horrendous. I mean, this is going to hit people as far down the food chain, if you will. What's going to happen to generation rent? Now, generation rent are all the young people who can't afford to buy anywhere, so they rent. Now, they're not going to be able to afford to rent. Some rents, since the last Bank of England rate rise, have gone up by as much as 40%. It's also going to hit businesses at a time when they've been through the pandemic. We've had a hell of a time. The last thing is for their costs of funding to operate their businesses to increase. It's going to hit all kinds of places. It's going to hit the whole equity release market, where older people borrow against their homes. They're not going to be able to afford to do that anymore, because as interest rates shoot up, you feel that 4.5% is, pretty healthy. But, to start ramping up compound interest on an equity release mortgage like that means that people aren't going to take that equity out of their homes in cash, means they're going to, with reduced pension and everything else, run out of enough money to meet their retirement, or certainly have to drastically reduce their level of living. I don't particularly buy the argument, and a lot of people have made it to me, that we need to keep up with the dollar. When you're choosing between eating and heating, who cares? How many US goods do you buy? How important is it really that we have to keep up interest rates to keep up with the dollar when everything else we face is pretty dire than I've seen in the many decades that I've lived here. So I'm a real opponent of interest rates being raised. What do you say to that?
Roger, you never ask a short question. You pack in all sorts of issues there all together. Let's start where you began.
You're one of the few people I know who can deal with them.
You start with renters, and I absolutely agree with you. The bit of the housing market which I'm most concerned about is young people who can't get on the housing ladder. There's been a lot of help in recent years from the Bank of Mum and Dad, and I think some of your later points about people not being able to withdraw their equity or get their equity out of their existing homes, they're really very relevant to that argument too, because that particular source of income from wealth cascading down the generations is not going to be very helpful or as helpful in current circumstances. I think one of the things which has happened is actually that all the and this may not be a very popular view, but all the favor in the rental market has been on the side of the landlords rather than the renters. So the renters have suffered, and I think that we could I'd like to see some changes in that market, so it becomes easier to be. So it encourages people to become a landlord rather than not become a landlord. I think that's what's happened. And so the rental market has become very short. And you're right. It's going to be very, very difficult to build up a pot of money to get yourself on the housing market. And when you do get on it, you'll be faced with quite tough interest rates as well. What we do have in the UK, which and I know there are a lot of squeezed people right at the very bottom, but we do have in the UK is we have near full employment. That means that people do have income flows to be able to finance their housing and other needs. Now, of course, they're going to be squeezed, and there's no doubt about it. I think all the data shows that perhaps as much as 15 to 20% of the population will find itself in what is defined as some sort of fuel poverty in the coming winter, and that can't be right. I think this business of choosing between food and heat isn't quite right, because I think we have in the UK, people forget this, we have a very good social security safety net, which should come in, and there are out there about 10 billions each year. I think it's more than that, 10 or 12 billions of unclaimed benefits. People need to explore what they're actually entitled to during difficult times, and to maximize their incomes as much as possible. But going back to your fundamental point, it's going to be a hard winter. It's going to be a winter when people are faced with higher interest rates because of the Bailey squeeze, and they're going to be faced with higher energy bills because of what's going on in Ukraine. But if you're going to fight a war, you have to live in wartime conditions, and the privations which people had to go through the Second World War and in the 1950s are quite strong. People were still on, when I was born in 1949, people were still on rations. And so we have to remember prosperity's moved on, and in that way that prosperity's moved on, so is where we measure poverty from. Of course, it's going to be hard pressed, and I don't want people to be very hard pressed, but actually I think that getting inflation down is really important, because inflation erodes people's savings. It will make it in the long term, it will make it much harder for people to get on that housing ladder, which you talked about earlier on.
Yes, but cost push inflation doesn't get solved historically by raising interest rates. And that's exactly the line the Bank of England took in 2009.
Well, I think what we have is we have several types of inflation all mixed up together here. If you go back to the financial crisis, and the amount of credit we've created in the United States, which you know a lot about as well, I think the Federal Reserve has increased the supply of money to the economy by 35% since the financial crisis. Here it's a bit smaller. It's less than 20%, it's about 17 or 18%, but that's monetary inflation. That is what is suppressed by interest rates. And it is all what is suppressed also by withdrawing quantitative easing, the printing of money which central banks are doing. So I do think there's time for a correction. Whether it's the right moment to have a correction when we're in the middle of a conflagration in the middle of Europe, and energy, people are changing their whole energy supply picture, is a whole different issue. And you may be right that there's we're trying to do too much all at once, which is going to make it very, very hard.
Yes, exactly. And when you call it a squeeze, we'll have a bad winter with the squeeze. What about the people who say it's going to be a lot more than a squeeze? There are going to be bodies lying all over the place.
That's rubbish. I think that's I actually think that is not correct. There's no reason why that should happen. As I said before, I think we have I think people underestimate the strength of the social safety net in Britain. And I've seen it work over the decades. And I think that that's a mistake to say that that's going to happen, because there is help for people if they go and get it. And people need to know how to apply for it. So I think there's a great big role to be played by people like yourself, who provide advice in this debt area. I think by the citizens advice bureaus, there's a huge amount of advice work to people, and there are one or two very good other websites which are very good at telling people how to apply for these benefits, which they don't collect. But I don't think there's any reason why people should be sleeping on the streets.
Where is, if this support from the government skyrockets, as this crisis unfolds, where's the funding for that going to come from?
Well, from borrowing, and in what economics tells us is that in times of high stress, wartime, and we're in sort of slightly wartime situation because of what's happening in Europe at the moment. I mean, this is an existential war for freedom and for democracy, which is taking place in Europe at the moment.
Sure.
And I think people have to make sacrifices, and we have a very good standard of living generally in the West. We shouldn't underestimate it. The average salary or median salary in Britain is £35,000. That's a pretty good median salary. Now, I know there's a lot of people fall below that, but we're not a poor country. And when it comes to borrowing, you increase borrowing. As it happens, and I've looked at the data on this, so the UK's level of debt to GDP, that's the amount of debt which the UK has borrowed, accumulated over the years, to the total output of the economy, which is GDP, is actually at a much lower level than that in the United States, that in Italy, that in Japan, that in France. So we actually have, and I don't hate you to use this term because it's talked about all the time in a very loose way, but there is a bit of headroom to do some more borrowing if we're in trouble. So we can begin to help people with their energy bills. We're going to help smaller businesses as well. So during COVID, there was a lot of support for pubs and smaller businesses and so on from the government, a break on business rates, a break on VAT, and I hope we'll see some of that too. And I think the new Chancellor, is developing some of that stuff at the moment. So hopefully we won't push too many companies over the edge. And what I'd also say, and this is, this may not appeal to you as much as it appeals to me, is that we've rescued business several times in the last 15 years. And that has left behind what I call a lot of zombie businesses which are only still kept afloat because they've got these subventions. So the economy sometimes needs a bit of a shock. And so I don't want to see high streets turned into wastelands. And indeed, some of them have been turned into wastelands already for a whole series of reasons. I think that's about changes in retail shopping and so on. But I think that there are some businesses which have become inefficient and have been overtaken by events and by technology, and I'm afraid to say it's going to be quite a difficult time for them.
Yeah, I'm all in favor of seeing zombie companies laid quietly to rest. That's for sure. But I just feel this is going to do more damage than just that. It's interesting that you've referred several times to World War II, Alex, because I keep thinking, why this headlong rush? I mean, if Rishi had become a prime minister, he wanted to pay off the COVID debt as quickly as possible. I mean, we took 61 years. The last payment was New Year's Eve, 2000, whatever it was, 5, 6, when we paid $83 million to finally pay off the World War II debt. 61 years. So, what's the hurry? Why can't we have more subventions and incur a bit more debt?
Well,
and not worry so much about the dollar.
Well, I think we'll know a lot more at the end of this week, but I think that's what the new renewed administration is going to do. My only problem about what the new administration is about to do is it's seen as very experimental. There is a huge lobby out there which opposes what they're going to do, and they're going to, the very people who normally advocate more help to the economy are going to be advocating more conservatism in the way we run the economy. But I think you have to take a long-term look at it, and you've made that point very cogently in the last few moments, and I absolutely agree with you. We have to accept that we're in sort of difficult, very unusual conditions. We've had crisis upon crisis upon crisis. We had the great financial crisis, we've had COVID, and we've got an energy problem all at the same, all one on top of the other, and none have been able to correct completely in between. So we got the public finances into much better shape between the financial crisis and the start of COVID, and that allowed us to pay our way through COVID very well. And I think there's still a bit of headroom left to keep on being able to do that. So on that happy note, I hope we can finish our conversation.
Okay, I'd like to ask you one more question.
Oh yeah, of course, yeah.
You mentioned energy, and there's a lot of people talking about energy. John Penrose, the MP who was the architect of the price cap, who says it's no longer fit for purpose and should be scrapped. has commented on this. Boris actually talked about it in June, I believe. And it's the issue that 2/3 of our energy bills are electricity. And 80% of, and the electricity bills are tied to the international market price for gas, of course, under conventions from the time gas, far back as when gas was privatized, back in the 80s. And yet, all sorts of people are pointing out that some 80% of our electricity has nothing to do with the international gas markets. 20% of it comes from our own gas, and 60% of it comes from nothing to do with gas, renewable, solar, wind, nuclear, things like that. And so that we are actually paying a very inflated price for 80% of 2/3 of our home energy bills. There's a new group called Electricity Watch, ukelectricitywatch.org or something like that, and all sorts of people coming out talking about this. What do you think about it?
Well, I think that you make a good point that actually electricity prices have not been going up at the same pace as gas prices. By the way, they've been much more modest. So if you're lucky enough to have a home which is more electricity dependent than gas dependent in terms of your heating and so on, then you're already in a better off space. But I do agree with you that we are pretty self-sufficient, much more self-sufficient about electricity. The problem we have with renewables, of course, is we can't hold on to them. So if the wind doesn't blow, we haven't got the fuel cells to keep the electricity going. So then we have to swing back into gas and pay the international price. So that's where we're very dependent. And of course, our nuclear independence is also a bit of a problem because most of our current nuclear fleet is pretty out of date and is going to be closing down in the next 3 or 4 years. And so we need to replace that nuclear fleet very rapidly. And that's a huge investment. Attracting that investment is very difficult. But there ought to be some mechanism, and I agree with you here, for making sure that UK consumers are better insulated from those international prices. Because as you say, we do, and of course, we actually have still quite a lot of gas resources which are unexploited in the UK, and so we ought to be able to do that. Now, I know people think, oh, the easy answer here is let's just slam a big tax on the energy producers, explorers, whatever you like to call them, and that seems a good option. And indeed, we have got a windfall tax on the big oil companies, and people want them on some of the middlemen as well, the distributors as well. And maybe that would help. But I'm much more interested in getting them drilling again in the North Sea on the continental shelf. Fracking is a good idea, but investment in new nuclear, that's the golden nugget. Look at France, for instance, where they get 60 to 70% of their daily electricity from nuclear. And inflation in France is about half what it is here. So they've reaped a huge dividend from being able to generate their own electricity. So that's a brilliant goal. We have we're very fortunate in Britain. We have a large large amount of coast, most of it owned by the Crown, by the way. In fact, the Crown finances, as you may or may not know, are tied. The Crown Estate owns most are actually tied to the Crown Estate. So when the wind blows, when we put up more renewable around the coast, the royal family gets richer. Anyway, that's a whole different story. But so there are all sorts of things we can do, but we need investment. Investment is absolutely critical. We've got to encourage all those people in the energy space, the middlemen, the explorers, the processors, the people who own the hydrogen plants and the cracking plants, and all those people who invest in new technology, in storage, and so on. And this is where the great thing is. But we're talking about a very long-term project, 10, 15-year project. It's not going to heat our own homes this winter, I'm afraid. One thing we have got, which some of our continental competitors do not have, is we have terminals in the UK which can process liquid natural gas pretty quickly at the Isle of in Kent and so on. And that's quite a good thing. The Germans are very busy trying to build these things at the moment, but we've already got them. So we bought some gas already from the United States. Centrica's been buying gas from the United States, and we have a long-term gas contract with Qatar. So hopefully the heating's not going to go off, but the heating's going to be very expensive.
You're getting all revved up and you're putting out pure gold. So could I beg your indulgence and squeeze one more little question out of you?
One more before I go. You've had me for nearly a half an hour. You know how much a half an hour of my time is worth?
A force inestimable.
Yeah.
And I'm very grateful, as I'm sure everybody who watches this will be, because this is really important. We are getting deluged with calls that the banks are coining it again. The interest rates are shooting up. They're making more money. And as always, they're not passing it on when we give them our cash.
Well, I'm not very pleased with the banks. They're reducing service all the time. On my local high street here in southwest London, Richmond, in the Richmond area, there used to be on our high street 5 banks. There's no banks left on our high street. The last one to go was the Barclays branch. It's just becoming a gal's patisserie now. So that's what happens to the banks. One of the other they've all become pubs and patisseries and restaurants and so on. And that's not very good. Also, they're very busy trying to convert us from paper on the grounds of recycling, but putting their processing onto our backs by making us process. And so I'm never pleased with the banks. I'm not pleased with them coining these vast sums of money either, particularly the domestic banks. I think the international banks, the ones which play in the international markets, in the investment markets, in the trading markets, in a slightly different position. But the high street banks should be utilities serving the public. And their profits certainly should not be storing away. They should be giving much more back to us, particularly to savers, because we opened the whole conversation this afternoon talking about mortgages. But do you realize that there are 7 times more savers than there are people with mortgages?
Yes.
They deserve something back too. And people who show some, reticence in the way they manage their finances, who are prudential, who are sensible, who follow that old maxim, never a borrower be, they don't get the rewards. And the banks, it's about time the banks gave them just rewards rather than just rewarding the people in the boardroom.
Alex Brummer, thank you so much for your incredibly sage advice and good humor as always. And thank you so much for giving us so much time. And we wish you well and see you again soon, I hope.
Hopefully so. Okay, nice to meet you again, Roger. Bye, thank you.
Bye.